I think we are ready to begin. Everybody still there? Excellent. Okay. I want to welcome everybody to today's mini webinar on yard and garden cleanup with insects and diseases in mind. Sorry about the little technical hiccup there. My name is Lisa Johnson. I am the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for Dane County. And today I have with me Diana Alfuth, who is the Horticulture Outreach Specialist in Pierce County. And we have Jay Dampier, who's our Horticulture Program Specialist, our Horticulture Program Manager, and most importantly, our speaker for today, Andrea Ackerman, who is the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for Brown County. A couple of housekeeping details. If you have questions today, please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to ask your questions. And you should be able to find this at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a laptop, if you're on a cell phone or tablet, you might need to tap the screen to bring up the menu that has that Q&A feature in it. We will, at the end of this presentation, get to as many questions as we can. Again, we're not using the chat feature, so please don't put your questions there. We are recording this webinar, and so the recording will be available later on the Extension website. You will see us bringing up occasionally a link to a survey that we'd really appreciate your filling out, that helps us to improve and bring you more great programming like this. So right now, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter. And this, again, is Andrea Ackerman from Brown County.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen all right, Lisa?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Diana and Lisa, for moderating today. Like Lisa said, I am Andrea Ackerman, and I can't even believe I'm talking about yard and garden cleanup already. It feels like I just put my garden in the other day, but I guess as the days get a little shorter and a little cooler, and we're enjoying our bountiful harvest from our gardens, we can't forget that fall is actually right around the corner and fast approaching. So I hope I can get you thinking about putting your garden to bed so that you can have a relaxing fall as well, and then give you some strategies that can benefit you and your yard or gardens, really keeping in mind plant diseases, insects, and then maybe a little bit of winter interest and supporting wildlife. Okay, so today we'll be going over a few key points as it relates to yard and garden cleanup. So like I said, plant diseases, insect pests, we'll talk about best practices, proper plant disposal, a little bit of leaf management, again, winter interest in the garden, supporting wildlife through the winter, and then we'll touch a little bit on the importance of tool maintenance. Okay, so two critical areas that we must consider when we're thinking about garden cleanup is really plant diseases and insect pests. I think those are the two main ones. So disease prevention begins with sanitation. So amongst other things, garden sanitation is really the removal of the plant material that can harbor both disease and insect pests. So plant diseases are very common in our yards, perennial gardens, vegetable gardens. And if you had a season like I did, maybe you had experienced some diseases of your own this year. So several disease-causing bacteria and fungi overwinter in our soils and in or on plant debris that would remain over the winter. So overwintering is where a plant pathogen survives the winter, during which its normal host plant is not growing. So a very common thing that occurs in our gardens. So this happens when the pathogen transfers to an alternate or alternative host, living freely in the soil or surviving on that plant debris that we left behind, or any remnants or garden weeds. So this applies to all types of gardens: home yards, perennial landscapes, vegetable gardens, container gardens. So sometimes those are often forgot about, and community gardens as well. So to reduce and deter overwintering pathogens in the yard and garden for the next season, cleaning up and properly destroying debris is most effective. Common diseases that overwinter include things like powdery mildew that affects a really range of annual and perennial plants, some like zinnias, squash, pumpkin, phlox, and bee balm or monarda. Leaf spot, which is really common in tomatoes and peppers, early and late blight on tomatoes, or even anthracnose on cucumbers. So as I said, there is two main considerations, that first being the plant diseases, and this is the second, the insect pests. So some of our most well-known insect pests that attack our home and community gardens do overwinter in the soil in some form. So this can be in the form of an adult or a juvenile. And it kind of depends on the species and the life stage of the insect and how they overwinter. So like the overwintering pathogens that we just touched on, they can be found deep in our soils, in the form of grubs, in our lawns, same thing, plant stems or debris. And a really great resource that I would recommend checking out in regards to types of plants and their life cycles is the University of Wisconsin-Madison vegetable crop entomology website. So it's at the bottom of this slide, so you should be able to see it down there at the bottom, the HTTPS. This really gives an overview of pests in Wisconsin, specifically as it relates to vegetable producers and home gardeners. Some things to note in terms of diseases and insects is that if you have a recurring disease in a very specific area of your garden and on a very specific crop year over year, it is really recommended to rotate your crops, especially in terms of vegetable gardens. So maybe if you see these diseases or insects, take notes at where they are occurring or where you're seeing the outbreak in your yard or garden so that you can maybe avoid that spot for the next season. So we'll go into some best practices for yard and perennial gardens. So I recommend starting by really looking or taking a peek at the weather and the forecast. So you want to ensure that you choose a day to clean your garden or yard that is dry, mostly sunny, preferably in the late morning or early afternoon. So that's really critical when you're thinking about getting ready to clean up your garden. So pulling plants and weeds during rainy days or early mornings can actually spread the spores of diseases. So in your garden. And then additionally, walking on wet soils. So if you get that early morning dew, or if it's after, immediately after rain or during a rain, you can impact your soil structure, which can cause garden health issues in the following season. So I just want to note that I do really understand that's not always possible to pick the best sunniest day. It's kind of whenever you have time, but just to keep that in mind when you're looking at cleaning up your garden, because it does lead to a healthier and more productive garden. So in your perennial garden, it is important to note that you don't need to cut everything down in the fall. In fact, it's recommended that you should actually leave some things standing up in your garden to support the wildlife and throughout the winter. It's always a good practice to remove any spent flower heads and annual plants, especially those that appear to have disease. And again, you'll want to cut down and remove any diseased plants. So diseased plants should also not be placed in the compost. There is no need to cut back low growing, evergreen or semi-evergreen perennials. Those items are hardy geraniums, heucheras, hellebores, moss or creeping phlox. So those can stay upright and you wouldn't need to cut those down. Additionally, you'll want to make sure that you go through and pull weeds before winter. It is important to do a final weeding before we go into winter, as any weeds left in the garden could go to seed and can produce hundreds of weeds for next season, and then you'll have your hands full there. Moving into best practices, a couple best practices for vegetable gardens. Again, still look at choosing that, dry, sunny day to begin your vegetable garden cleanup. And I want to be clear that this applies to traditional in-ground vegetable gardens, container gardens, raised beds, any herb garden, anything like that is what I'm referencing when I talk about vegetable gardens. So before you begin to pull out any plants, really go through and harvest any of the remaining fruits or vegetables on those plants. So you can save or store the mature and best looking ones, and then discard any of the immature or rotten fruits. You can also put that in your compost if they are disease free. If the immature fruits are disease free, you can put those in your compost as well. If you notice disease on them, it is recommended to bag those and throw them away and not put them in your compost. So you'll want to be sure to pull any garden labels, stakes, cages, hoses or irrigation lines, trellises, anything that you put in your garden as a support structure or to label your garden. So you should also remove any dirt or debris from those items so that you're not hanging on to that soil from year to year. And you can rinse them with soapy water if that's necessary. Also, you'll want to remove any of the inorganic mulches that you may have used. So if you use like a black plastic, film in your garden bed, that doesn't decompose readily and can potentially harbor insects. So you just want to remove any possibility of inviting pests into the garden over the winter. And then when cleaning garden beds, you really want to remove the entire the entire plant. So what I mean by that is everything from the roots all the way to the leaves. So you might have leaves on the plant in the garden bed. If it's a raised bed, maybe they fell outside of the bed. So making sure you're cleaning up all around where you have those plants placed. As most fungal pathogens overwinter in plant debris, it is best to bag and throw away any severely infested plant material. The rest of the garden plants that does not have disease is best to bag and throw away. Oh, excuse me. I'm skipping around here. Any of the stuff that doesn't have disease can be thrown in the compost. The stuff with disease needs to be bagged and thrown away. So when I say compost, I'm referring to a hot compost, meaning that the core temperature of your compost pile reaches between 120 and 170 degrees. That will ensure that you are killing weed seeds, insect eggs, and potential pathogens. So if you're using a compost, I'm recommending using the hot compost to get rid of those potential hazards or overwintering diseases or insects. If you use shredded or fallen tree leaves, you can spread them evenly over your garden bed after you've cleaned it out and work them into a shallow depth. So you also don't really need to add lime or wood ash in your garden bed. And I would also recommend that if you have not done so or haven't had one in the past, like say 5 years, is to get a soil test done. So collect a few samples before the ground freezes and get it tested through this UW Soils Lab. So again, at the bottom of this slide, there is a web address that'll take you right to the soils page for more information on soil testing. And then again, always pull the weeds before winter so you don't have those hundreds of weeds knocking at your door in the beginning of spring. Okay, often when we think about yard cleanup, one of the biggest tasks is figuring out what to do with all of the fall leaves. So there are several options in my opinion, and you can use one strategy, you can use a mix of them, or yeah, however you see fit. So the first, you can leaf them. Yes, the pun was intended there. Laughing at myself because I can't hear anyone else. But ecologically speaking, you do not need to rake your leaves. Just know that a heavy layer can actually smother your lawn or grass and prevent new growth in the spring. So it may not be recommended to leave the leaves on the lawn specifically, but if it's in a garden bed, that might be okay. Compacted leaves can also promote snow mold diseases and damaged turf, which we just talked about. In the garden bed, you can leave them where they fall as a protective layer for the winter. If you want to remove the leaves from your garden, you can add them to your compost pile rather than bagging and hauling them away. Composting the leaves is a great way to recycle nutrients. Use the leaves as a mulch by running them over with a mower and returning the shredded leaves to the flower beds, or just leaving a thin layer in the lawn. Okay, as most pathogens and insects overwinter in the plant debris, it is best to, like we talked about, bag and throw away severely infested plant material. So that's if you're seeing a lot of disease, it's recommended to throw that away. So you really want to avoid putting that into your compost or leaving in your garden bed over the winter, as those pathogens really do have a potential to survive the winter in our compost piles or in our garden soils, and especially if they don't reach a hot enough temperature to kill them. So that's that between 120 and 170 to really have an effect on those pathogens. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel really fortunate to be able to live in an area that has all four seasons, and I get to enjoy my garden spaces throughout the four seasons in vastly different ways. So really thinking about unique plant characteristics and how they play a large role in winter interest in the garden. So really looking for plants with interesting bark, branches, stem color. These provide interesting structures in the winter. So maybe when you're considering taking some plants down, think about the structure, how their characteristics could, increase or impact your winter interest or your winter garden. Many plants hold on to their ornamental fruit throughout the winter. So these persistent fruits not only provide this winter interest that we're looking for, but can be used for a source of food for wildlife. And then with or without leaves, plants, they have a specific form. So you often see different tree shapes or shrubs that have a different shape and forms, and that can be a really stunning addition to the garden, especially when there's a light dusting of snow. Um, so consider that before you do any pruning or cutting. And then seed heads and cones. This is really fun because these do provide a lot of great interest and also are a great food source for wildlife, and lingering foliage is also a unique texture and can provide shelter for birds. Unique characteristics in our plants allows us to actually enjoy our gardens from a different perspective during the winter. So I really recommend considering leaving perennials that add interest to the winter landscape, like ornamental grasses with their tall, flowy plumes, and perennials, say maybe something like blue false indigo baptisia, that has interesting elongated black seed pods. So leaving anything with a lot of interest for you to enjoy. And then talking about providing supporting wildlife. So some plants provide food for birds, and you should not actually cut these down before the winter. So goldfinches, they really like the seed heads of the purple coneflower, or the echinacea. Overwintering birds find protection in the plant stubs and ground covers. Many perennials do help beneficial insects in winter by providing shelter from predators, and many plants hold on to their ornamental fruit, like we kind of talked about previously, through the winter. So this fruit not only provides the winter interest, but also that food source that we're looking for to support our wildlife. So just some things to consider during your cleanup. And lastly, I want to just touch on tool maintenance as we're talking about yard and garden cleanup. So I think this is often overlooked. It can be a really great late fall or winter task if you're, itching to or dreaming of those days of summer where you're out in the garden digging. So once you're done with your yard and garden cleanup, you'll want to ensure that you clean your tools as well. So plant pathogens like bacteria, fungi, and viruses cause diseases that do kill plants. So they can be transferred to and infect plants through, bits of soil that you left on your shovel or trowel, and plant debris, tree sap maybe on your pruners, or soil left in one of your pots or containers. Pathogens are microscopic and often unseen to the eye. So while your tools may look perfectly clean, these microorganisms may still be growing and lingering. So prevent the spread of disease between plants by thoroughly cleaning and disinfecting your tools, equipment, and garden implements. Garden implements being those garden stakes, trellises, tomato cages, things like that. So our tools are exposed to plant diseases throughout the season. So I really say do yourself a favor and clean and sharpen your tools in containers before putting them away for the winter. And then next spring, you'll just thank yourself because it's one less task you have to do before, the busy seed starting and planting season comes through. So wash your pots with bleach solution, clean and sharpen those pruners, loppers, shovels, and trowels. All right, so here's a list of resources that I used throughout the presentation. So if you have an opportunity to take a look at some of those great websites. And that is all. So thank you so much for allowing me to get you ready for fall and fall cleanup. And I will turn it over to Diana for questions.
All right, thank you, Andrea. That was wonderful. Gives us a lot of things to think about. The gardening season goes so fast, and winter and cleanup time will be here before we know it in all parts of the state. So we've had some really good questions come in. Probably the most common question relates to powdery mildew, and this is a very common disease. And powdery mildew is a little different than a lot of other diseases because it affects a lot of different kinds of plants. And but there are lots of different strains of it. And what powdery mildew likes is it's not really a soil-borne disease, but it likes warm, humid conditions. And so if you have powdery mildew on lilacs, that means conditions are right for you to have it on your bee balm and your phlox and your squash and anything else that's susceptible to a particular strain of it. So the questions come in about, like one question was they've had it on their zinnias, and can you plant zinnias in the same area next year? And basically, yes, because it's not really a soil borne, but it gets back to what you were talking about, Andrea, of cleaning up plant debris, because those spores will overwinter on fallen leaves of diseased plants this year. But also note that powdery mildew is pretty ubiquitous. It blows for a long ways in the wind. And so if conditions are right and you have a susceptible host, you're probably always going to be dealing with a little bit of it. So as far as composting it, Andrea, do you have any recommendations about otherwise cleaning it up and getting rid of it? I know Dr. Brian Huddleston, our disease diagnostician, always says if you compost it, as you mentioned, up to 120 to 140 degrees, that will kill most things. Otherwise, you can bury it like a foot deep. Or if you are in an area that allows burning, yes, burning also takes care of these things. So anything else about controlling powdery mildew for the next year?
No, Diana, you touched on that too, that I was going to say in regards to burning and burying as other options. And then also looking at seed selection, or seed or plant selection. So sometimes there are species that are bred for a little bit more resistance than others. So taking that into consideration for the next gardening season as well.
All right, and along with that, Andrea, you mentioned composting versus some of these diseases really should be thrown in the trash. And there was a question about Do you throw it in the trash, or is sending it off to your municipal composting site okay? And I guess, if it's really a bad disease, the trash is probably better, because you're not always sure how your municipal compost site composts, and if they get everything heated up as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also would look at your local regulations. So I know some municipalities do not allow to throw in the trash, or maybe it has to be in a black trash bag. So just understanding if you can put plant refuse in the trash. And I agree with the local compost. It's questionable whether, you're not sure what their practices are. So you could always reach out to whoever is in charge of that. But I think the best bet would be to bag it and throw it away if it's something that is really rampant and susceptible in your garden.
Can I interrupt for just a second? Andrea, there's been a couple requests to put up the the web resource page. Thank you.
No problem.
Awesome.
And this is recorded, so you'll be able to go back and watch later, and then you can also snag some of those resources at that time too, if you didn't get them all, if you don't have a pen and paper ready.
And also in the chat box, we did post the site where this will be posted. It takes us about a week to get the closed captioning stuff done and get it put up there, but you can find a recording of this mini webinar along with the others that we've done there, so you can rewatch them as many times as you want. So there are some other questions about, you mentioned cleaning tools and what exactly to use, and you'll see recommendations for both bleach and alcohol. If you choose to use bleach, that can be caustic and damage your equipment. So if you use bleach, the recommendations usually are to let it soak in the bleach for at least 30 to 60 seconds to kill the pathogens, but then rinse it off with clear water. You don't want that bleach sitting on there, because it can actually damage the tools. And I believe the alcohol concentration is 70%. Am I remembering that right, Andrea?
Yep, I was just gonna say that 70% for the alcohol. And I do think it depends on the material, like you said as well. If you have like, wood versus metal versus like a ceramic pot or something like that. It really depends on what you're going to use.
All right. And then back to the powdery mildew, there's a question of, does it actually hurt the plant? And really, for most cases, powdery mildew is a cosmetic disease. Other than some of the vining vegetable plants, it's not lethal. So it's kind of cosmetic. So there's really not a need to control it. But as you said, Andrea, getting resistant varieties of plants is probably your first and best bet. And so I just want to mention, we are about out on time here, so we can't get to all of the questions, but remember that we have resources here to get your personal questions answered. You can go to our state extension horticulture website, and there is an option there to ask an expert or ask a question. It'll be directed to the extension person who is handling your county, and you can get some specific questions answered there. You can also, as I mentioned, find the recordings to these webinars, as well as a whole lot of other great articles and publications on specific things. And probably the take-home message from your presentation, Andrea, as I see it, is that there are lots of different kinds of diseases and insects out there. Some of them are harmful, some of them are beneficial, well, the insects anyway. And so if you do have a plant disease or an insect, your first step really is to identify exactly what it is. That might mean contacting us in your counties or the disease diagnostics clinic, find out what it is, what its life cycle is, how to control it, and just what kind of a threat it may or may not be if you don't clean it up going into winter. So I want to thank you, Andrea, and everyone for participating today. Again, we have the evaluation that we would really appreciate you doing. That link has been put in the chat box a couple of times, along with the site for where you can find the recording of this. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Andrea. And we
Thank you.
appreciate everyone's participation. Thanks, Lisa. And we do have another mini webinar coming up in, I forgot the date, but maybe about a week. A couple of things here getting ready for going into the season. So thanks again.